An elderly father arrives at his daughter's wedding, expecting to walk her down the aisle after years of strained relationship. Instead, he's coldly told by his daughter that he's not welcome inside and must sit outside during the ceremony. As rain begins to fall, he contemplates leaving forever. But when the priest's words carry through the church doors, they reveal a truth that will change everything he thought he knew about his daughter's feelings and their broken relationship. The parking lot of St. Mary's Cathedral stretched before me like a sea of polished cars, each one worth more than I'd made in my last year before retirement. I sat in my old Ford pickup, hands trembling as I adjusted the rear-view mirror to check my appearance one more time. The navy suit I'd bought for this day, Sarah's wedding day, felt stiff against my shoulders, but it was the best I could afford. 68 years old, and I was more nervous than a teenager on his first date. My daughter was getting married today, and after 3 years of barely speaking to each other, I wasn't even sure she wanted me here. But a father doesn't miss his little girl's wedding. No matter what happened between us, no matter how much I'd apparently failed her, this was my chance to make things right. I stepped out of the truck, my knees protesting with that familiar ache that reminded me daily that I was getting old. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the elegant stone church, and I could hear the soft murmur of guests arriving inside. Women in flowing dresses and men in expensive suits moved up the steps with confident strides. I didn't belong here, and I knew it. But Sarah was my daughter, my only child, and I'd traveled 600 miles from my small apartment in Ohio to be here. The last time I saw Sarah was at Christmas dinner 3 years ago. What started as a hopeful reunion had ended with her screaming at me about how I'd ruined her childhood, how I'd never been the father she needed, how my drinking had destroyed our family. I tried to explain, tried to tell her that I'd been sober for 5 years by then, that I was trying to make amends, but she wouldn't hear it. She told me she was better off without me, and that maybe it was time I accepted that. I'd left that night with my heart broken into pieces I didn't think could ever be put back together. But today was different. Today was her wedding day, and surely she'd want her father there. I'd called her mother, my ex-wife Linda, 2 weeks ago to get the details. Linda had been hesitant, her voice tight with that familiar tension that still existed between us, even after all these years. "Robert, I'm not sure this is a good idea," she'd said. "Sarah hasn't mentioned wanting you there. She's my daughter, Linda. I have a right to be at her wedding." There had been a long pause. "You gave up a lot of rights when you chose the bottle over your family, Robert, but if you think you can handle it without causing a scene, then I suppose it's between you and her." Now, standing in front of this beautiful church where my daughter was about to marry a man I'd never met, I wondered if Linda had been right. Maybe I should have stayed home. Maybe some mistakes are too big to come back from. I walked up the stone steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. The doors to the church were tall and imposing, made of dark wood with brass handles that gleamed in the afternoon light. Through the glass panels, I could see the inside was filled with people. Flowers decorated every surface, and soft music drifted out each time someone opened the doors. As I reached for the handle, I heard my name being called from behind. "Dad?" I turned around, and there she was, Sarah, my little girl, though she wasn't little anymore. At 32, she was a beautiful woman in an elegant white dress that made her look like something out of a fairy tale. Her dark hair was pulled up in an intricate style that must have taken hours, and her makeup was perfect. But her eyes, those same green eyes she'd inherited from me, were cold as winter. "Sarah, sweetheart, you look absolutely beautiful," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "I'm so proud of you." She didn't smile. Instead, she looked me up and down with an expression I couldn't quite read. Behind her stood 2 women I didn't recognize, probably bridesmaids, watching our interaction with obvious discomfort. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice flat and emotionless. "I'm here for your wedding, honey. I wouldn't miss it for the world." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see something working behind her eyes. The women behind her exchanged glances, and one of them whispered something I couldn't hear. "I didn't invite you," Sarah said finally. The words hit me like a physical blow. "I know, but I hoped. Sarah, you're my daughter. This is the most important day of your life, and I wanted to be here to support you. Support me." Her voice rose slightly, and I could see heads turning in our direction. "Where was your support when I was 12 and had to call Mom to come pick me up from school because you were passed out drunk at home? Where was your support when I graduated valedictorian and you missed it because you were at Murphy's bar instead?" "Sarah, please," I whispered, aware that we were drawing attention. "I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I've been sober for 8 years now. I've changed." 8 years, she repeated, shaking her head. Do you know how many years I needed a father? How many school plays, soccer games, birthday parties you missed? How many nights I cried myself to sleep because I thought it was my fault that my daddy didn't love me enough to stop drinking. Each word was like a knife in my chest, but I deserved every one of them. You're right, I failed you. I failed you in every way a father can fail his child. But Sarah, I love you. I've always loved you, even when I was too sick to show it properly. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and for a moment I thought I saw something soften in her expression. But then it was gone, replaced by that same cold determination. I don't want you here, she said simply. This is my day, and I don't want it ruined by having to worry about whether my alcoholic father is going to cause a scene. I wouldn't, Sarah. I would never. You can't sit inside, she continued, cutting me off. But if you insist on staying, there's a bench around the side of the church. You can sit there if you want, but you're not coming inside. You're not walking me down the aisle. You're not part of this. I felt like I was drowning. After driving 600 miles, after buying a new suit I couldn't afford, after practicing what I would say to her for weeks, this was not how I'd imagined this moment going. Sarah, please, that's my final decision, Dad. Take it or leave it. She turned and walked toward the church doors, her bridesmaids following behind her like a protective barrier. Just before she reached the entrance, she looked back at me one more time. The bench is around the left side, she said, and then she was gone, disappearing into the warmth and light of the church while I stood alone on the steps. I wanted to get in my truck and drive home. I wanted to find the nearest bar and order a whiskey, the first I'd had in 8 years. I wanted to disappear and never have to feel this kind of pain again. But something kept my feet planted on those stone steps. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just the desperate hope that somehow, some way, this day might still end differently than it had begun. So I walked around the side of the church, found the small wooden bench Sarah had mentioned, and sat down. From here I could hear the music starting inside, could hear the murmur of the congregation as they prepared for the ceremony to begin. The sun was starting to set, and the first drops of what looked like an approaching storm began to fall from the darkening sky. As I sat there in my good suit, listening to my daughter's wedding through the stone walls of a church I wasn't allowed to enter, I wondered if this was what I deserved. Maybe this was the price of all those years I'd chosen alcohol over my family. Maybe some things really were too broken to fix. The rain began to fall harder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, preparing to sit through whatever came next. The rain started as a gentle mist, barely more than a whisper against my face as I sat on that cold wooden bench. But within minutes, it had turned into a steady drizzle that soaked through my jacket and made my hair stick to my scalp. I should have gotten up, should have run to my truck and driven away from this humiliation. But the music drifting through the stone walls of St. Mary's Cathedral kept me frozen in place. I could hear the organ playing Canon in D, the same piece that had played at my own wedding 35 years ago. Linda had looked so beautiful that day, walking down the aisle toward me with such hope in her eyes. We'd been so young, so convinced that love would be enough to overcome anything life threw at us. We had no idea that I carried a darkness inside me that would eventually poison everything we built together. The memory of my own wedding made sitting outside Sarah's even more painful. I was supposed to be the one walking her down the aisle today, supposed to be the one placing her hand in her new husband's and giving her away with a father's blessing. Instead, I was relegated to a bench in the rain, like some unwanted stranger. Through the stained glass windows, I could see shadows moving inside the church. The ceremony had begun, and I could hear the muffled voice of the officiant speaking to the gathered congregation. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm of his speech told me they were probably going through the opening remarks, welcoming everyone to this joyous occasion that I was excluded from. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe it was Sarah, maybe she'd changed her mind. But when I pulled it out, the screen showed a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, asking if I'd made it safely to the wedding. I'd told her about the trip, how nervous I was, how much this meant to me. Now I'd have to go home and explain why I was sitting outside in the rain instead of celebrating with my daughter. The rain was coming down harder now, and I was starting to shiver. My suit was getting soaked, the fabric clinging to my skin uncomfortably. I looked around for somewhere with better shelter, but there was nothing except the bench and the unforgiving stone walls of the church. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent so many years seeking shelter in bottles of whiskey, and now I couldn't even find shelter from a simple rainstorm. As I sat there, My mind wandered back to when Sarah was little. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, and we'd been caught in a sudden downpour while walking home from the park. Instead of running for cover, she'd started dancing in the rain, her little arms stretched wide as she spun around in circles, laughing with pure joy. I'd scooped her up and spun her around with me, both of us getting soaked but not caring because we were together. "Daddy, can we dance in the rain again tomorrow?" she'd asked when we finally made it home, her hair dripping and her clothes muddy. "We can dance in the rain whenever you want, sweetheart," I'd promised her. But that was before the drinking got bad, before I started breaking promise after promise until she stopped believing anything I said, before I became the kind of father who passed out on the couch while his 6-year-old daughter made herself dinner because mommy was working late and daddy was sleeping again. The music inside the church changed, becoming softer and more romantic. I knew they must be exchanging vows now, speaking words of love and commitment to each other, while I sat outside like a forgotten ghost from Sarah's past. I wondered what kind of man she was marrying. Was he good to her? Did he make her laugh the way she used to laugh when she was little? Would he be the kind of husband I should have been to Linda, the kind of father I should have been to Sarah? I tried to find out about him through social media, but Sarah had blocked me years ago. I knew his name was Michael something. Linda had mentioned it during our brief phone call, but beyond that, he was a complete mystery to me. My daughter was marrying a stranger, and it was my own fault that I knew nothing about the most important person in her life. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. The storm was getting worse, and I was getting more soaked by the minute. My shoes were filling with water, and I could feel it seeping through to my socks. This was miserable, sitting here in the rain like a homeless man outside the most important day of my daughter's life. But then I heard something that made me forget all about my discomfort. Through the heavy wooden doors of the church, I could hear the priest's voice more clearly now. The acoustics of the old building carried his words, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Sarah Mitchell and Michael Harrison," the priest was saying, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ceremony. "But before we proceed with the vows, the bride has asked me to share something with you all." There was a pause, and I found myself leaning forward on the bench, straining to hear through the rain and thunder. What could Sarah possibly want to share at her own wedding? My heart started pounding, and I had a terrible feeling that whatever came next was going to be about me. "Sarah wants you all to know," the priest continued, his voice projecting clearly now, "that her father was invited to this wedding. In fact, she very much wanted him here today." My mouth fell open. That couldn't be right. She'd just told me 20 minutes ago that she didn't want me here, that I wasn't invited. But the priest was still talking, and what he said next made my entire world tilt on its axis. "She knows that many of you are aware of the struggles her family went through when she was younger, and she wants you to understand that those struggles don't define the man her father became. Robert Mitchell has been sober for 8 years now, and Sarah is incredibly proud of the work he's done to rebuild his life." I couldn't breathe. The rain was streaming down my face. Mixing with tears, I didn't even realize I was crying. Sarah was proud of me? She knew about my sobriety? But then why had she told me to sit outside? The priest's voice continued to carry through the storm. "Sarah asked me to tell you this because she knows that some of you might be surprised to see her father here today, given their past. But she wants you to know that forgiveness and healing are possible, even when the wounds run deep. Her father's presence here today represents not just her wedding day, but a family that has found its way back to love despite years of pain." I stood up from the bench, my legs shaky and my heart racing. This didn't make sense. If Sarah had said all of this, if she'd wanted me here, if she was proud of me, then why was I sitting outside in the rain? Why had she looked at me with such coldness? Why had she refused to let me into the church? Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and the thunder that followed seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and I was completely soaked through, but I barely noticed the storm anymore. All I could think about was the disconnect between what the priest was saying and what Sarah had told me outside the church. "However," the priest continued, and his voice took on a sadder tone, "Sarah also wants you to know that her father chose not to attend today. Despite being invited, despite her hopes that he would be here, he decided that he wasn't ready to face this step in their healing journey." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not ready to attend? Chose not to come? What was happening here? Sarah is disappointed, but she understands. Sometimes the people we love aren't ready to accept the forgiveness we want to offer them. Sometimes they're so trapped by their own shame and guilt that they can't see the love that's waiting for them. I felt like I was going to be sick. Nothing made sense. Sarah had told the priest I was invited, that she wanted me here, that she was proud of me. But she'd also told him I'd chosen not to come. Meanwhile, here I was, sitting in the rain outside her wedding, having been explicitly told I wasn't welcome. Something was very, very wrong, and I was beginning to suspect that the truth was more complicated than either Sarah's coldness outside or the priest's words inside could explain on their own. The storm was reaching its peak now, with rain lashing against the church walls and wind howling through the trees that surrounded the building, but I barely noticed the weather anymore. All I could focus on was trying to piece together what was really happening here, and why my daughter seemed to be telling two completely different stories about whether she wanted me at her wedding. As the priest's voice faded back into the general murmur of the ceremony, I realized that I needed answers. I needed to understand what was going on, and why the woman who'd coldly banished me to a bench in the rain had apparently told her wedding guests that she was proud of me and disappointed that I'd chosen not to attend. Something wasn't adding up, and I was beginning to suspect that this wedding held secrets that went much deeper than my own complicated relationship with my daughter. The thunder crashed overhead like God himself was slamming doors in heaven, and for a moment I couldn't think straight. The priest's words kept echoing in my mind. Chose not to attend, wasn't ready, disappointed. But I was here. I was sitting in the pouring rain outside my daughter's wedding because she'd told me I wasn't welcome inside. How could she tell her guests I'd chosen not to come? I wiped the rain from my eyes and tried to make sense of what I'd heard. Either the priest had gotten his information wrong or Sarah had lied to him. But why would she lie about something like that? Why tell her wedding guests that she'd invited me and was proud of my sobriety, only to turn around and banish me to a bench in the storm? The rain was soaking through my clothes now, making my shirt stick to my skin and my pants feel heavy and uncomfortable. I should have been miserable, should have been focused on how cold and wet I was getting, but all I could think about were those words. Sarah is incredibly proud of the work he's done to rebuild his life. Proud of me. When was the last time anyone had said they were proud of me? Certainly not in the last 8 years of sobriety. Mrs. Henderson had congratulated me when I'd hit my 1-year mark, and my sponsor Tom had been supportive throughout my journey. But proud? That was a word I'd given up hoping to hear, especially from my daughter. I stood up from the bench, water dripping from my suit, and walked closer to the church wall. Maybe if I got closer to one of the windows, I could hear more clearly what was being said inside. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to piece together this puzzle that made no sense. As I pressed myself against the cold stone wall beneath one of the stained glass windows, I could hear the ceremony continuing inside. The priest was talking about the nature of love and commitment, about how marriage required forgiveness and understanding. His words seemed to carry extra weight in the context of what he'd said about me just moments before. Love, the priest was saying, his voice clear through the storm, is not just about the easy times. It's about choosing to see the best in someone even when they've shown you their worst. It's about believing in someone's capacity to change even when they've disappointed you before. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the stone wall. How many times had Linda believed in my capacity to change? How many promises had I made and broken before she finally gave up on me? And Sarah, my little girl, had watched me disappoint her mother over and over again until Linda finally took her and left. The memory of that day still haunted me. Sarah was 15, old enough to understand what was happening, but still young enough to be devastated by it. She'd stood in the doorway of our house while Linda loaded suitcases into the car, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, please don't let us go," she'd begged me. "Please just stop drinking and come with us." But I was too far gone by then, too deep in my own misery and denial to see what I was losing. I'd told her they'd be better off without me, that I was no good for them anyway. The look of betrayal in her eyes that day had haunted my dreams for years. However, the priest continued inside the church, pulling me back to the present moment, love also requires honesty. It requires us to acknowledge when someone's actions have caused real harm, even when we want to forgive them. That was when I heard something that made my heart stop. Through the rain and wind, I could hear Sarah's voice. She was speaking to the congregation, though I couldn't make out all her words. But what I could hear made me understand that this ceremony was about more than just her marriage to Michael. "Many of you know about my relationship with my father," Sarah was saying, her voice carrying the same strength and determination I remembered from when she was a little girl standing up to bullies on the playground. "You know that he struggled with alcoholism throughout my childhood, and that it caused our family a lot of pain. I pressed closer to the wall, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Why was she talking about me at her wedding? Why was she sharing our private family struggles with a church full of people? What you might not know, Sarah continued, is that my father has been sober for 8 years now. 8 years of hard work, of attending meetings, of trying to make amends for the damage he caused. 8 years. She knew. She'd been keeping track of my sobriety, even though we hadn't spoken in 3 years. That meant something, didn't it? That meant she still cared, at least a little bit. I invited him to my wedding today because I believe in second chances. I believe in forgiveness. I believe that people can change, and my father has proven that change is possible. I felt my knees go weak. She had invited me. The priest had been telling the truth. But then why had she told me I wasn't welcome? Why was I standing outside in the rain if she'd actually wanted me here? But, Sarah's voice continued, and I could hear the emotion creeping in now, my father chose not to attend today. When I invited him, he told me he wasn't ready to face our family and friends. He said he was too ashamed of his past to celebrate my future. What? That was completely wrong. I had never said anything like that. I'd never even gotten an invitation. I'd only found out about the wedding from Linda, and even then she'd seemed reluctant to give me the details. I want you all to know that I understand his decision, Sarah was saying, her voice stronger now. Shame is a powerful thing, and sometimes it keeps us from accepting the love and forgiveness that's being offered to us. Sometimes it's easier to stay away than to risk being hurt again. That was when everything clicked into place, and I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Sarah thought I had chosen not to come. She thought I had rejected her invitation, rejected her attempt at reconciliation, but I'd never gotten an invitation. Someone had made sure I never got that invitation. My mind raced back to my phone call with Linda 2 weeks ago, how reluctant she'd seemed to give me the wedding details, how she'd said Sarah hadn't mentioned wanting me there. Linda had intercepted the invitation. Linda had made sure I never knew that Sarah wanted me here. And then when I showed up anyway, Sarah assumed I was rejecting her olive branch, choosing pride and shame over her attempt at forgiveness. The rain was falling harder now, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on the realization that my daughter had wanted me here, had publicly defended me and my sobriety, had been disappointed when she thought I'd chosen not to come. And I'd responded to that disappointment by showing up uninvited, confirming in her mind that I was still the selfish man who put his own comfort above her needs. So today, Sarah continued inside the church, as I marry the man I love, I want to honor my father's journey even though he's not here to share it with me. I want you all to know that recovery is possible, that people can change, and that love can survive even the deepest wounds, even when the people we love aren't ready to believe it themselves. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this. I could hear the emotion in her voice now, could picture her standing at the altar in her beautiful white dress, talking about me with a mixture of love and sadness that broke my heart into a million pieces. She'd wanted me there. She'd been proud of me. She'd believed in my capacity to change, and I'd let her down again without even knowing it. But now I understood why she'd been so cold to me outside the church. From her perspective, I had rejected her invitation and then shown up anyway, probably to cause drama or make her wedding day about me and my problems. She thought I was being manipulative, thought I was still the same selfish alcoholic who had put my own needs above hers for so many years. The ceremony was continuing inside, but I could barely focus on the words anymore. I was too busy trying to figure out what to do with this new understanding. How could I explain to Sarah that I'd never gotten her invitation? How could I make her understand that I hadn't chosen shame over love, that I'd driven 600 miles because I desperately wanted to be part of her special day? Thunder crashed overhead again, and a particularly strong gust of wind drove the rain sideways, soaking me even more thoroughly than before. But I barely noticed the storm anymore. All I could think about was my daughter inside that church, believing that her father had rejected her one more time, even when she'd finally been ready to forgive him. I had to do something. I had to find a way to make her understand the truth before this day ended, with both of us more broken than when it began. I stood there against the cold stone wall, rain streaming down my face, trying to process everything I'd just learned. My daughter had invited me. She'd wanted me here. She'd been proud of my 8 years of sobriety, and I'd never even known it. The weight of this revelation felt heavier than the storm clouds above me. But how could I prove it to her? How could I make Sarah understand that I'd never received her invitation, that her mother had intercepted it? If I tried to explain, Would she even believe me? Or would she think I was just making excuses like I used to do when I was drinking? The ceremony was continuing inside, and I could hear the exchange of vows beginning. Michael was speaking now, his voice deep and confident as he promised to love and cherish Sarah for the rest of his life. I should have been sitting in the front row, watching my little girl marry the man she loved. Instead, I was hiding outside in a thunderstorm, trying to figure out how to undo a misunderstanding that had cost me the chance to be part of the most important day of her life. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, water dripping onto the screen as I scrolled through my contacts. I needed to call Linda. I needed to confront her about the invitation, needed to understand why she'd kept Sarah's olive branch from reaching me. But as I stared at her number, I realized that calling her now wouldn't solve anything. Even if she admitted what she'd done, it wouldn't change the fact that Sarah believed I'd rejected her. The rain was coming down in torrents now, and I was shivering uncontrollably. My teeth were chattering so hard I could barely think straight, but I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I finally understood what had really happened here. Through the storm, I could hear Sarah's voice as she spoke her vows to Michael. Her words were muffled by the wind and rain, but the emotion in her voice carried clearly through the stone walls. She was happy. Despite everything that had happened, despite believing that her father had rejected her one more time, she was genuinely happy on her wedding day. That should have made me feel better, but instead, it made my heart ache even more. I'd missed it. I'd missed the moment when my daughter promised to love someone for the rest of her life. I'd missed seeing her face light up as she looked into her new husband's eyes. I'd missed being the father who got to witness his child's greatest joy. A flash of lightning illuminated the church grounds, and in that brief moment of brightness, I saw something that made me freeze. There was a figure standing near the main entrance to the church, partially hidden under the overhang. It was a woman in a dark blue dress, and even from a distance, even through the rain, I recognized her immediately. Linda. My ex-wife was standing outside the church, just like I was, but unlike me, she was staying dry under the covered entrance, and unlike me, she could easily go inside if she wanted to. So why was she standing out there? I pushed away from the wall and started walking toward her, my soaked shoes squishing with every step. The rain was so heavy now that I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, but I kept moving toward the front of the church. I needed answers, and Linda was the only person who could give them to me. As I got closer, I could see that she was crying. Her makeup was running down her cheeks, and her hands were shaking as she clutched a small purse against her chest. She looked as miserable as I felt, which didn't make sense. Why would she be standing outside her own daughter's wedding, crying in the rain? "Linda," I called out as I approached the entrance. She turned toward me, and the expression on her face was a mixture of surprise, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Robert, what are you doing here? You're soaked to the bone." "What am I doing here?" I could hear the anger rising in my voice, even over the sound of the storm. "I'm here for my daughter's wedding, Linda. The question is, why are you standing outside when you should be in there watching Sarah get married?" She looked away from me, staring out at the parking lot where the rain was creating rivers between the cars. "It's complicated, Robert." "Complicated how? And while we're at it, why don't you explain why Sarah never got the invitation she apparently sent me? Why don't you explain why our daughter thinks I chose not to come to her wedding?" Linda's face crumpled, and she started crying harder. "I was trying to protect her, Robert. I was trying to protect both of you. Protect us from what? From each other? From the possibility that we might actually work things out? From more disappointment?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the church entrance. "From more broken promises and more heartbreak? Do you have any idea how many times Sarah has been hurt by hoping you would change? How many times she's built up her expectations only to have you crush them?" I stared at her, rain dripping from my hair into my eyes. "But I have changed, Linda. I've been sober for 8 years. 8 years without a single drink." "I know," she whispered so quietly, I almost couldn't hear her over the storm. "I've been keeping track. I've been watching from a distance, hoping it would stick this time, hoping you were really getting better." "Then why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "If you knew I was sober, if you knew I was trying to make amends, why did you keep her invitation from me?" Linda was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush. "Because I was scared, Robert. I was terrified that you'd show up and somehow ruin her perfect day. I was afraid that seeing you would bring back all the pain and anger, that it would overshadow what should be the happiest day of her life. So you made the decision for her," I said, feeling a familiar surge of the anger that had gotten me into so much trouble over the years. "You decided what was best for Sarah without even giving her a choice." "Yes," she admitted, meeting my eyes for the first time since I'd approached her. I intercepted the invitation. I told her I'd mailed it to you, but I never did. And when she didn't hear back from you, I let her believe you'd chosen not to respond. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not just Linda's betrayal, but the realization that Sarah had reached out to me and I'd never even known it. She'd taken the brave step of trying to rebuild our relationship, and Linda's interference had made it look like I didn't care. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I asked, my voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "Sarah is in there right now getting married, believing that her father rejected her one more time. She's carrying that pain with her on what should be the happiest day of her life." "I know," Linda sobbed. "I realized what a mistake I'd made as soon as I saw how hurt she was when you didn't respond, but by then it was too late. I couldn't tell her the truth without admitting what I'd done, and I couldn't face disappointing her again. So you let her think I didn't care about her wedding. You let her think I was still the same selfish drunk who put his own comfort above her happiness. I'm sorry, Robert, I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I've made everything worse." Through the heavy wooden doors of the church, we could hear the congregation singing a hymn. The ceremony was moving toward its conclusion, and soon Sarah would be walking back down the aisle as a married woman. If I was going to do something, if I was going to try to fix this mess, I was running out of time. What comes next is even stronger, and to not miss the ending, tap the subscribe button now. It's free, and you'll be with me in every new story. "Why are you standing out here in the rain, Linda?" I asked, suddenly realizing that she was as miserable as I was. "Why aren't you inside watching your daughter get married?" She looked at me with eyes full of regret and pain. "Because I can't face her, Robert. I can't sit in there and watch her get married knowing what I've done, knowing that I'm the reason you're not walking her down the aisle. I've been standing out here for the last hour, trying to work up the courage to go inside, but I can't do it." "You have to," I said firmly. "Of whatever you've done, whatever mistakes you've made, Sarah needs her mother in there with her. She needs at least one of her parents to witness this moment. But what about you? What are you going to do?" I looked at the heavy wooden doors of the church, then back at Linda's tear-streaked face. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I can't leave things like this. I can't let Sarah go through the rest of her life thinking that her father didn't care enough to come to her wedding. There has to be a way to make her understand the truth." Linda wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup even more. "She won't believe you, Robert. If you try to tell her that I intercepted the invitation, she'll think you're just making excuses. She'll think you're trying to manipulate her like you used to when you were drinking." I knew she was right. Sarah had heard too many of my excuses over the years to trust anything I said now, but I had to try something. I had to find a way to reach her, to make her understand that I'd never stopped loving her, never stopped wanting to be part of her life. The hymn inside the church was ending, and I could hear the priest beginning to pronounce Michael and Sarah husband and wife. In a few minutes, they would be walking back down the aisle together, and this whole nightmare would be over. Sarah would be married, and she'd carry the pain of believing her father had rejected her into her new life, unless I could find a way to change that. Unless I could find the courage to do something I'd never been brave enough to do before, tell my daughter the complete truth about everything, even if it meant risking her anger and rejection one more time. The hymn ended, and through the heavy wooden doors, I could hear the priest's voice rising above the storm. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Michael, you may kiss your bride." A cheer went up from inside the church, the sound of celebration and joy that should have included me. I stood there in the rain with Linda, both of us soaked and shivering, both of us excluded from the moment we should have been sharing with our daughter. But while Linda's exclusion was self-imposed guilt, mine was based on a lie that was tearing my heart apart. "They'll be coming out soon," Linda said quietly, wiping rain from her face. "Robert, you should go. If Sarah sees you here when she comes out, it'll ruin her wedding photos. It'll create a scene that she'll never forgive either of us for." But I wasn't moving. Something inside me had shifted when I heard the priest pronounce Sarah married. A determination I hadn't felt in years was building in my chest, stronger than the shame and fear that had controlled so much of my life. My daughter deserved to know the truth, even if that truth was complicated and painful. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not leaving. Not like this." "Robert, please." "Linda, do you still have the invitation? The one you intercepted?" She looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in her eyes. Yes, it's at home. I kept it. I don't know why, but I kept it." "Because you knew what you did was wrong," I said, not unkindly. "You kept it because some part of you knew that someday the truth would have to come out." The doors of the church began to open, and the first guests started to emerge, laughing and talking as they prepared to brave the storm. Linda grabbed my arm, panic in her eyes. "Robert, you can't do this here. Not now. Not on her wedding day." But before I could respond, the main doors opened wide and Sarah appeared, radiant in her white dress, her arm linked with Michael's. They were both laughing, running through the rain toward a waiting car decorated with flowers and ribbons. Behind them came the wedding party, guests hurrying to their own vehicles, everyone trying to escape the downpour. I stepped forward, out from under the overhang, directly into Sarah's path. She saw me immediately and stopped so abruptly that Michael nearly collided with her. The laughter died on her face, replaced by a mixture of confusion and anger that I recognized all too well. "Dad, what are you still doing here?" she called out over the rain. "I told you." "Sarah, wait," I shouted back, my voice carrying over the storm. "Please just listen to me for 1 minute. Just 1 minute, and then if you want me to leave, I'll go and never bother you again." She looked around at the guests who were stopping to watch this unexpected drama unfold on the church steps. Michael was whispering something in her ear, probably trying to convince her to just keep walking. But Sarah had always been stubborn, even as a little girl, and I could see her making the decision to hear me out. "1 minute," she said, her voice cold but resigned. "But make it quick. My guests are getting soaked." I walked closer to her, close enough that I could see the rain beading on her veil, close enough to see the hurt in her green eyes that she was trying so hard to hide behind anger. "Sarah, I never got your invitation," I said, speaking as clearly and loudly as I could so she could hear me over the storm. "I found out about your wedding from your mother 2 weeks ago, and even then she tried to discourage me from coming. I drove 600 miles from Ohio because I desperately wanted to be here, not because I was trying to cause problems." Sarah's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, doubt maybe, or confusion. "That's not true," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I mailed the invitation myself. I put it in the mailbox outside my apartment." "And your mother picked it up," I continued, knowing I was taking a terrible risk by exposing Linda's deception in front of all these people, but seeing no other choice. "She intercepted it because she thought she was protecting you from more disappointment. She never told me you'd invited me. She never told me you wanted me here." Sarah's head turned sharply toward Linda, who had been trying to stay hidden under the overhang. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was barely audible over the rain, but the word carried the weight of 1,000 questions. Linda stepped forward, her face pale and streaked with tears and rain. "Sarah, honey, I can explain." "Did you?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "Did you intercept my invitation to Dad?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity, even with the rain pounding around us and the wedding guests standing awkwardly nearby, unsure whether to give us privacy or stay close enough to help if needed. "Yes," Linda finally whispered, the word barely audible. "Yes, I did." Sarah stared at her mother for a long moment, and I could see the pieces clicking into place in her mind. The betrayal, the manipulation, the months of believing her father had rejected her olive branch when he'd never even known about it. "How could you?" Sarah's voice was breaking now, and I could see tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "How could you do that to me? Do you have any idea how much it hurt when I thought Dad had ignored my invitation?" "I was trying to protect you," Linda said desperately. "I was afraid he'd disappoint you again, afraid he'd somehow ruin your special day." "That wasn't your decision to make," Sarah shouted, and several of the guests took a step back. "It wasn't your choice whether or not to forgive him. It wasn't your right to decide what was best for my relationship with my father." Michael stepped forward and put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Honey, maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere private. Your guests." "No," Sarah said firmly, shrugging off his hand. "This needs to be said right here, right now, in front of everyone." She turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd seen her outside the church, her expression softened slightly. "Dad, is it true? Have you really been sober for 8 years?" "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse with emotion. 8 years, 3 months and 12 days. I've been to over 2,000 AA meetings. I've worked the steps. I've made amends to everyone I could find who I'd hurt during my drinking years. Everyone except you, because I didn't know how to reach you, didn't know if you'd even want to hear from me." Sarah was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide her tears behind anger. "I did want to hear from you. I've wanted to hear from you for years. That's why I sent the invitation. That's why I told everyone at my wedding about your sobriety, about how proud I was of you for getting your life together." The words hit me like a lightning bolt. "You're proud of me?" "Of course I'm proud of you," she said, taking a step closer to me. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to get sober? Do you know how many people never manage to do what you've done? I've been following your progress through Mrs. Henderson for years. She sends me updates every few months, tells me how you're doing, how you're volunteering at the community center, how you've become the kind of man I always hoped you could be. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, who I thought was just being kind when she asked about my day and listened to my stories about AA meetings and volunteer work. She'd been reporting back to Sarah all this time, keeping my daughter informed about my journey toward recovery. I wanted you to walk me down the aisle today, Sarah continued, her voice barely audible over the rain. I wanted you to meet Michael, to see how happy I am, to know that despite everything that happened when I was growing up, I turned out okay. I wanted you to be proud of me too. I couldn't speak. The emotions were too overwhelming. The relief and joy and heartbreak all mixed together in a way that made it impossible to form words. Instead, I did something I'd been afraid to do for 8 years. I opened my arms and took a step toward my daughter. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she broke away from Michael and ran toward me, her white dress getting soaked as she threw her arms around my neck. I held her tight, feeling like my heart was going to explode with the combination of love and regret and gratitude that flooded through me. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I whispered into her ear. I'm so sorry for all the years I wasn't the father you deserved. I'm sorry I missed so much of your life. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. I'm sorry too, Dad, she whispered back. I'm sorry I was so cold to you when you showed up today. I thought you'd rejected me again, and it hurt so much that I just wanted to hurt you back. We stood there in the pouring rain, holding each other while wedding guests watched in amazement, and Linda sobbed quietly under the church overhang. This wasn't how either of us had imagined this day would go, but somehow it felt right. It felt like the beginning of something new, something better than either of us had dared to hope for. When we finally pulled apart, Sarah looked up at me with those green eyes that were so much like my own. Dad, I know this is unconventional, but would you like to come to the reception? There's still time for you to meet Michael properly, to celebrate with us. I looked down at my soaked suit, at my rain-soaked hair, at the mess I probably looked like after standing in the storm for over an hour. Honey, I'm not exactly dressed for a reception anymore. Sarah laughed, and the sound was like music after years of silence between us. Dad, you're perfect just the way you are. The reception hall at the Riverside Country Club was everything I'd expected Sarah would choose for her wedding. Elegant, warm, and filled with the kind of details that showed how much thought she'd put into every aspect of this day. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over round tables, decorated with white roses and gold accents, and the walls were lined with photographs of Sarah and Michael's relationship, from their first date to the proposal. I stood in the men's restroom, trying to make myself look presentable. The club staff had been incredibly kind, providing me with towels and even offering to send someone to buy me a new shirt. But Sarah had insisted I was fine as I was, and somehow, with my hair combed back and my jacket dried as much as possible, I almost looked like I belonged here. When I emerged from the restroom, Michael was waiting for me in the hallway. Up close, I could see that he was probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes and the sort of steady presence that told me he'd be good to my daughter. He was still in his wedding tuxedo, looking every bit the successful young man that Sarah deserved. Mr. Mitchell, he said, extending his hand, I'm Michael Harrison. I'm sorry we're meeting under such unusual circumstances. I shook his hand, noting his firm grip and direct gaze. Please call me Robert, and I'm the one who should apologize. I certainly didn't plan to turn your wedding into a family drama. Michael smiled, and I could see why Sarah had fallen in love with him. Actually, I'm glad you're here. Sarah's talked about you more than you might think, especially in the last few months. She's been wrestling with whether to reach out to you, and I encouraged her to send that invitation. You did? I lost my own father when I was 26, Michael explained. Cancer, and one of the things I regret most is that we never had the chance to resolve some of the issues between us. When Sarah told me about your recovery, about how you'd been working to rebuild your life, I told her that second chances are rare and precious. I'm glad she listened. We walked together toward the main reception hall, and I could hear music and laughter coming from inside. Michael, I want you to know that I'm grateful you encouraged her to reach out. And I want you to know that I'll understand if you'd prefer I not stay long tonight. This is your day, yours and Sarah's, and I don't want to overshadow that. Robert, Michael said, stopping just outside the entrance to the hall, Sarah has been carrying the weight of your absence for 15 years. If having you here tonight helps heal that wound, then there's nowhere else I'd rather you be. When we walked into the reception hall together, the room seemed to pause for a moment, Conversations quieted as people turned to look at us, and I could feel the weight of dozens of curious stares. These were Sarah's friends and colleagues, people who knew the story of her childhood and probably hadn't expected to see her estranged father at her wedding. But then Sarah appeared at my side, having changed from her wedding dress into a simpler but still elegant reception gown. She slipped her arm through mine and addressed the room with the confidence I remembered from when she was a little girl, giving presentations at school. "Everyone," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "I'd like you to meet my father, Robert Mitchell. He's been through a long journey to get here tonight, and I'm grateful he made it." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. These people might not know me, but they loved Sarah, and they could see that having me here made her happy. Over the next hour, I found myself in conversations I never could have imagined. Sarah's friends asked me about my work at the community center, about my recovery journey, about what it felt like to see my daughter so happy and successful. Her colleagues from the marketing firm where she worked told me stories about her professional accomplishments, about the campaigns she'd led and the promotions she'd earned. I learned that Sarah had bought her own apartment in downtown Portland, that she'd run 2 marathons, that she'd been dating Michael for 3 years before he proposed during a weekend trip to the coast. I learned about the volunteer work she did at a local literacy program, about her plans to start a family in a few years, about the life she'd built for herself despite, or maybe because of, the challenges of her childhood. But the moment that nearly broke me came when the DJ announced it was time for the father-daughter dance. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to invite Sarah and her father to the dance floor for a special dance." I started to shake my head, started to tell Sarah that we should skip this tradition since I'd missed so much of the evening already, but she was already taking my hand, already leading me toward the center of the dance floor. "Dad, I've been dreaming about this dance since I was 6 years old," she said softly. "Please don't make me wait any longer." The opening notes of Butterfly Kisses began to play, and suddenly I was transported back to when Sarah was small, when she used to stand on my feet while we danced around the living room to whatever song was playing on the radio. Back then, I'd promised her that someday I'd dance with her at her wedding, back when I still believed I'd be the kind of father who kept his promises. "I can't believe you remember those dances in the living room," I said as we swayed together on the dance floor. "I remember everything good, Dad," Sarah replied, her head resting on my shoulder. "I remember you teaching me to ride a bike and reading me bedtime stories, and the way you used to make pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings. The drinking didn't erase those memories. It just made them more precious, because they reminded me of who you really were underneath all the pain." As we danced, I could see Linda sitting at one of the tables, watching us with tears in her eyes. We still had a lot to work through, she and I, about the invitation and the lies and the years of miscommunication, but tonight wasn't about our failures as parents. Tonight was about celebrating the incredible woman our daughter had become, despite our mistakes. "Sarah, I need you to know something," I said as the song neared its end. "I'm going to do better this time. I'm going to be the father you deserve from now on. I'm going to be present for your life in whatever way you'll let me." "I know you will, Dad, but I need you to know something too. I forgive you for all of it. The drinking, the missed events, the broken promises. I forgive you and I want you in my life." When the song ended, the room erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. I was too focused on my daughter's face, on the love and forgiveness I saw there, on the miracle of second chances that I'd never thought I deserved. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of joy and connection. I talked with Linda, and while we didn't resolve everything, we agreed to work together to be better grandparents when that time came. I listened to the toasts and speeches, hearing story after story about the remarkable woman Sarah had become. I watched her dance with Michael, seeing the pure happiness on both their faces, and when it came time for Sarah and Michael to leave for their honeymoon, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I love you, Dad. Don't disappear on me again." "Never," I promised her. "I'll be here for whatever comes next." As I watched their car drive away into the night, decorated with ribbons and cans, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 years of sobriety, thousands of meetings, countless nights of wondering if I'd ever have the chance to make things right with my daughter. I'd driven to this wedding expecting to sit in the back row, hoping just to see Sarah happy from a distance. Instead, I'd discovered that love really could survive the deepest wounds, that forgiveness really was possible, and that sometimes the storms that seem like they're going to destroy us are actually washing away the barriers that have kept us apart. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, tap the red button that says subscribe. It's free and it helps me keep sharing. Mrs. Henderson was going to be so surprised when I called her tomorrow to tell her about the wedding. She'd been Sarah's secret connection to my recovery journey all these years, and now she'd finally get to hear that her quiet updates had helped prepare my daughter's heart for this moment of reconciliation. As I drove home through the quiet night, I realized that this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, the beginning of the relationship with my daughter that I'd always wanted but never known how to build. The beginning of being the kind of father who showed up not just for the big moments, but for all the small ones too. And for the first time in more years than I could count, I was looking forward to tomorrow, knowing that it would include my daughter's voice on the phone, her laughter in my life, and the chance to finally be the father she'd always deserved. The storm had passed, and in its wake everything was new. Everything